Welcome everybody to Trinity's panel discussion on the future of higher education, which is part 2 of the series of Imagining a Post-COVID World, if only. I'm Catherine Ibbett, I'm the fellow in French at Trinity, and I'm already happy to see some familiar names in the audience and look forward to meeting more. Just some housekeeping questions before we get started on introducing our speakers. I'd like to ask you to stay muted throughout the sections when the speakers are talking to us, and in fact when other people are asking questions. If you can unmute yourself when we call on you to ask a question. If you have a question, it's best to put it in the chat box. And we can take care of questions coming in that way. We are going to be recording, but only the speakers will be visible during the recording, and names will not get displayed on the recording. So you can hide behind your screens there. Let me turn then to introduce our speakers. I'm immensely grateful to them for coming out, so to speak, to do this evening or this morning, depending on where they are. I know it's a moment when the future of higher education chiefly feels exhausting, and I'm especially grateful, therefore, that they've come to talk with us this evening. I think we have a great deal of expertise represented on this panel from the humanities. I know we have other areas of expertise present in the Zoom room, and I'm looking forward to hearing perspectives from you later on. But I'm really, really grateful that our speakers represent a wide variety of institutions and have a great deal of international experience. I think that's going to help us to de-Oxford our conversations in ways that I think will be fruitful. So I'll just tell you the 4 speakers' names. I'm going to give a closer introduction of each of them right before they speak, but we're going to hear from Dinah Birch, who's an Honorary Fellow and Pro VC at the University of Liverpool, from Piers Ludlow, who's Professor of International History at the LSE, from Mary Marcy, who's University President at Dominican University in California, and from Michelle Clayton, who's Professor of Spanish at Brown University in Rhode Island. So our first speaker, Dinah Birch, Pro Vice Chancellor for Cultural Engagement and Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool. Dinah is an Honorary Fellow of Trinity, having taught English here some years ago. She's published widely on Victorian fiction and poetry and on the critic John Ruskin. She's the General Editor of the Oxford Companion to English Literature, has served as a member of the Man Booker Prize panel in 2012. I need to ask her how you get through that much reading in that shorter time, is a regular contributor to the TLS and the LRB, and president of the British Association for Victorian Studies. And even in the midst of all that, she's made time to talk to us tonight about internationalization in HE. Dinah, over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's a real pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. So I want to say something about the future of internationalization in higher education. It's something that will undoubtedly be influenced by the pandemic, which is changing the flow of students and the patterns of research across the world. The UK is a leading nation in terms of educating international students and global research collaborations, and we have been among those regions most immediately affected. It may be that some of this impact will be short-lived. And in fact, the student recruitment crisis in the UK, first envisaged, hasn't materialised, I'm happy to report. And research partnerships do, of course, continue. But the consensus is that there won't be a return to business as usual anytime soon. The climate emergency and Brexit were already changing the picture for the UK. Maybe that Piers will have a little bit more to say about Brexit in a few minutes. I'm going to focus on the global context, wider global context in what I have to say. Some of the most immediate concerns have been financial. International students pay substantially higher fees than home students in the UK and often elsewhere. And many universities, particularly large research intensives like Oxford, have grown accustomed to this income stream. Rightly or wrongly, this resource has subsidized the costs of research in Britain because research income through grants and other funding is increasingly inadequate to cover those costs in full. So any decrease in the number of international students will have an impact on our research base, alongside the difference it will make to educational priorities. There'll be consequences for research in that, among other consequences, it's likely that we'll all be traveling less attendance of conferences, fewer research trips, fewer meetings. Some of this activity can take place online. But genuine research collaborations evolve slowly, and they do depend on personal connections and trust, on academics knowing each other. Not all of that painstaking work can be replicated through the kind of Zoom meeting that we're all attending at this moment. And if there is one thing that the pandemic has taught us, it is that research cannot and should not be a wholly national business. The challenges that confront us, climate change, future pandemics, energy generation, biodiversity, those are challenges that span national boundaries and will continue to do so. So, shrinking overseas student numbers would limit research programs, but they would also change the makeup of our communities, and not, in my view, for the better. Oxford is an example of a truly global university, attracting staff and students from scores of nations and regions and sending its graduates out to change the world. Every major UK university, including the University of Liverpool, my own institution, takes pride in teaching students from every corner of the globe. Their recruitment isn't by any means simply a financial transaction. Those students and staff furnish the rich, diverse community that's part of the experience that we want to offer international students, but also, crucially, to offer to our home students. And those two things are inextricably connected. We wouldn't welcome a future in which our recruitment was entirely UK-based, or even predominantly UK-based. And it's clear that colleagues outside Britain would also not wish to recruit entirely within national borders. We need both strong UK home recruitment, also strong international recruitment. We're not alone in this. It's interesting, for instance, that Japan is currently pressing ahead with a really ambitious program of expansion of their internationalization ambitions in higher education, pandemic or not. And here I'll say something briefly about Chinese students in the UK. China sent more students to the UK than any other overseas country in 2009-20. 35% of all non-EU students in the UK were from China. The number of students from China has increased by 56% over the 5-year period 2015 to 16 to 2019-20. And those numbers are now under pressure. Though in our own experience, and I should say that Liverpool educates more Chinese students than any other UK university. In our experience, those numbers have been perhaps surprisingly resilient, partly because of the commitment of students from our partner institution in Suzhou, Zhangjiaotong University. And we, like other universities in the UK, have benefited from the fact that the USA does now feel like a hostile environment, or has done in the past, the recent past, for Chinese students. Now, there are those who would prefer to see an end to this particular flow of students and to our multiple research partnerships in China for security reasons and for political reasons. There is no doubt that the political situation in China under Chairman Xi Jinping is darkening, and we need to be very sensitive to the implications of that, particularly, I would argue, with regard to any perceived attempt to influence what we teach our Chinese students. And we do need to be extremely vigilant about security issues, a topical concern, of course, at the moment, as you all know. But I remain convinced, and I'll be interested to hear the views of others on this, that the balance of benefit continues to lie in our engagement with China, partly because China is an increasingly powerful and influential presence on the world stage. I think it would, in the long term, be counterproductive simply to put up the shutters, but also because we owe it to our colleagues in China and to intelligent and curious young people in China to provide opportunities to encounter a different culture, different values, different ideas in ways which do influence their future outlook in the People's Republic. I hope that the post-COVID higher education sector in the West will continue to engage thoughtfully and carefully with China. So, to summarize, internationalization within higher education has been challenged, is currently under pressure, but it will remain a central pillar of our strategies. Despite the calamities of COVID, the appetite among young people to travel and to learn outside their own countries remains strong. And in the UK, at least, the policy environment is positive. The reintroduction of the 2-year post-study work visa, for instance, worth mentioning as an important welcoming factor, particularly for students from the Indian subcontinent. The new UK touring programme will offer funding for studies in countries beyond Europe, previously only possible for students who could fund themselves. Inclusive teaching practices, and that's a point I don't have time to expand on, it's important. So too will the capacity of universities to offer a really rewarding social and cultural experience. That will be important. We need international students and staff. We must not take them for granted. Their continuing presence, with all that it has to offer, will call for serious thought and an imaginative and targeted allocation of resource. They amount to more, very much more than an income stream. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinah. That was terrific. We're going to go over now. If you have questions for Dinah, feel free to begin to put them in the chat so we can accumulate things later. But we're going to go over now to Piers Ludlow, who is Professor of International History at the London School of Economics. His main research field is the history of Western Europe since the Second World War, especially the European integration process and West-West relations during the Cold War. His last book was Roy Jenkins and the European Commission Presidency, 1976 to 1980, which came out from Palgrave in 2016. His next is likely to be an overview, this is really sad to say, of Britain's 46 years as an EC/EU member state. You'll understand I'm not sad about the book itself, merely the curtailing of its time study. Since Piers is also head of department, I'm imagining that book won't be forthcoming immediately, but I'll be impressed if it is. Piers, over to you. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Sadly, your last comment about the delay on the book is all too accurate. I suspect it will be a few years yet.
I know this
is something that will gain from a little bit of distance. I am happy to talk about the B word, Brexit, in the Q&A, but actually what I thought I'd do was talk about some other stuff. But please do feel free to come back to me about the implications of Brexit, about which I have spent quite a lot of time talking and thinking recently in the question and answer. What I thought I'd do, though, instead was to throw out a few thoughts about the structure of the UK university system, and in particular, sort of its funding assumptions, and some of the difficulties that these pose. These are not necessarily things that are caused by COVID. Indeed, I would argue that most of the points I'm making are sort of pre-existing difficulties. But as so often, a moment of crisis sort of highlights pre-existing difficulties. And I think the events of the last year or so have thrown into sharper relief some of these difficulties. I think the first one that I would highlight is what I do think is a worrying mismatch between the way in which higher education is justified and conceived of by students, would-be students, their parents, etc., and perhaps the wider public, and the way in which it, by contrast, is seen by those of us who work in the sector. It does strike me that we've moved over the last 10 years or so into a model where the process of paying for higher education and the new higher fees that have come in over that period is justified by the presentation of university, both as a kind of luxury product full of bells and whistles and all sorts of extraordinary experiences and beautiful buildings and fantastic teaching and so much else. So it's presented as a really kind of high value status good, but also something that will stand students in very good stead as they move out into their future careers, and they will earn more, etc., from having graduated and so on. Now, you can understand why those arguments have been made, but in the current context, of course, that's deeply problematic, because I think students do understandably feel that while universities have gone to huge lengths to try and preserve as much of the university experience as we can, and we were talking just before sort of joining the wider audience about the ways in which we've all tried to translate tutorials and lectures and seminars and things into online experiences, inevitably there is a sense that university in the COVID world is not quite what the students thought they were signing up to. And they ordered the stretch limo, and instead the battered camper van has turned up, and they do therefore start saying, well, we want some of our money back. Now you can see where that comes from their point of view, because of the manner in which university has been presented to them and sold to them. The reality, of course, from an institutional perspective, as anybody who's on the sort of the university side of the fence in the UK knows, however, is that COVID has not made life any cheaper for us. On the contrary, we've actually seen a lot of our costs go up because of the pandemic, and we therefore desperately need those £9,000 that are being paid by students. There's no chance of giving them a discount because of what we're not being able to offer them, or what we're not able to give them this year or last year. So there is a real tension here, and I think that's a tension that does go to the heart of the future funding model. I'm not certain I have any easy answers, but I do get worried by the public debate about education, because it strikes me that we really haven't communicated effectively to the general public how universities, or what universities use the money for, what people are paying for, and how this sector needs money to survive. The second thing, and Dinah has already touched upon some of this, that I think comes out very strongly in the COVID era, but again is an underlying problem that is arguably there before COVID and will post-date the pandemic, is the underlying fragility of some of the income streams upon which we have all come to rely. The harsh reality is that most universities in the UK do not make money, indeed they barely cover their costs with student fees. If we just had 9,000 a year per student coming in, most of us would not be able to continue to work as we work. Instead, we've become dependent on a whole series of other things that bring in extra money. Dinah dwelt a lot on one of those key things, which is the flow of international students. I won't say more about that, although I entirely agree with her about their importance. But there are other things. Something like my own institution, the LSE, depends enormously on things like the summer school, which was cancelled last year because of COVID, will probably be cancelled this coming year for COVID. Other universities and us rely on renting out student accommodation for conferences, etc. We make money on the cups of coffees and the meals and so on that we sell through campuses. Now, all of those revenue streams have collapsed because of COVID, which does put the whole university finance position in a very precarious position, with worrying implications, not perhaps for the Oxfords or even the LSEs of this world, but for several other institutions. I think it is deeply problematic. And that then brings me to my third point, namely, which is I think the pandemic has underlined even more starkly than before the huge range of, so the huge difference in the standing and stability of different institutions across the UK. We talk about a university sector, but the reality is that we have a whole series of different university sectors. And whether it be in the experience we can offer students, whether it be in our ability to withstand crises and shocks like that which we're going through, whether it be in many, many other things, the experience of a Russell Group university at one end and the experience of a university sort of slightly lower down the feeding chain is vastly different. And I do worry about that. Now, that difference predates COVID, but COVID has made it worse. And the way in which, for instance, the A-level fiasco led to a situation where a lot of A-level students were able to go to their preferred choice of university because restrictions on how many students were taken were lifted. Well, that was great for those of us at the top of the feeding chain, but for those lower down who probably would have got students as their sort of plan B or possibly even plan C or D, those institutions are struggling because the students haven't turned up. So I do think there's a real problem that is being highlighted by this crisis in the vast disparity that has been allowed to grow up in the types of university the UK have. Now, maybe we should have different types of university, maybe diversity is a good thing, but I do think we need to worry about the fragility of some of the players in the sector. And I do worry that we are going to see some universities go bust before too long, which is of course a deeply worrying prospect for all of us involved. Final, last, slightly more optimistic point, though, that I would like to end on, because I don't want to just be a gloom and doom merchant. I do think the one thing that the pandemic has underlined, though, is the extraordinary and continuing thirst for higher education on the part of students. When the pandemic started, I took part in all sorts of gloomy LSE discussions about how we expected international student numbers to collapse, how we expected people not to turn up, how we were going to be, well, we weren't allowed into empty corridors, but how the virtual corridors would be empty, etc. Quite the opposite. We actually have a situation where numbers of students, both here this year, but also applying for next year, are at record levels. And there is a huge sort of thirst and demand there for what universities provide. And even the commitment and sort of passion of those at university is arguably better this year than ever before. I think a lot of us teaching feel that for all the eccentricities of teaching through a computer screen and not being able to sit in the same room as other people, actually the students, perhaps because they don't have so many things to distract them, are better prepared and more on top of their reading and their writing than has ever been the case before. So I think that does underline a sort of underlying strength. What we do is still needed, appreciated, and wanted, but I do think there's some serious structural problems about the way in which we're funded and the way in which this money is distributed across the sector that we need to think about seriously as we move into a post-COVID world.
Thanks, Piers. That was great. I appreciate also the gesture to the parents, who I think are a kind of key factor in this. I've long thought we need a sort of infographic that would explain how UKHE financing works and what the fee does in all that. We're going to move now across the Atlantic. So our second set of speakers our West Coast and East Coast respectively. We're going to begin with Dr. Mary Marcy, who is the president of Dominican University in California and a higher education strategist whose research is focused on the sustainable nature of HE institutions. And her scholarship centers on emerging innovation, on strategic planning for higher education, and organizational change management. Her recent book, The Small College Imperative: Models for Sustainable Futures, was named by Forbes as one of the top higher education books for 2020. And she's recently published an article in Inside Higher Ed about 4 questions that colleges and universities can ask to help them move from a sort of immediate tactical response to COVID to a strategic planning for a longer term future. And I'm really excited to hear about that. Mary, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And my instinct is to say good morning, but I think I would be talking only to myself. So, but it's lovely to see so many other Trinitarians here. I'm going to pick up a bit on my colleague's initial outline, give perhaps a bit more perspective from the US, trusting that Michelle will expand on the US as much as needed. Starting with the financial piece Peter's just talked about, because I think there's much that we can learn from each other in this space. Indeed, the pandemic has not created a financial challenge in higher education, but it has accentuated it. And in some cases, it has put institutions and students and their families that were on the brink in a much more precarious position. So to give you some specific data, I know that the question of who pays for college is essential everywhere. Many institutions, certainly in the United States, are what we call a high tuition, high financial aid model. We're one of them. I believe Michelle's is another, where students, the total cost is high, but there's a tremendous amount of financial aid. The idea is that the net tuition revenue is a big part of what funds then the institution. Net tuition revenue in higher education in the United States in the last 2 decades, pre-pandemic, was absolutely flat. So that meant that model has not been working for some time. And so institutions began to seek many other spaces to try and generate revenue, not necessarily educational spaces. That was the situation coming into the pandemic. Now you have a situation during the pandemic where the higher education workforce in the United States has shrunk by 13%, just since last March, which is a shocking number and a very troubling one. And you see budget reductions at institutions of anywhere from 10 to 25%. So certainly for those of us who are in higher education, these are quite alarming statistics, because we know that institutions were in many cases in difficult shape before. For those who care about why higher education exists, I would suggest that they are even more sobering, because the challenge to the quality of what happens within higher education and the variety, for example, of majors that may be offered, I think is going to be significant. So for example, if students believe, as Pierre suggested, that we often say higher education is about access to great networks and a great job, and therefore, it will pay off, so go ahead and pay up. That means that there's likely to be a much bigger demand even than there was prior to the pandemic for those majors and those disciplines that lead obviously to high-paying jobs. That is not the purpose or even the primary purpose of higher education, but it has become the selling point for higher education. And that I think is deeply challenging and problematic. I also think that there'll be greater homogenization, and I do believe you'll see some closings and consolidations in the sector here. Another big piece of higher education, I think not only in the United States, but around the world, we have a particular view of it here, is around a shift in student demographics. So higher education here, like many other places, was built primarily with assumptions that a student would go to college full time, probably very high in their class before they went to college, all kinds of assumptions about their backgrounds. That's no longer the case. The American population is becoming increasingly diverse, and so is the student population. So for example, California is now a minority state. In my own institution at Dominican University of California, which is in the Bay Area, over half of our students are students from underrepresented groups. So this is a massive shift across American higher education, one to which we are still adapting. There's also a very large number of students now who are the first in their families to attend college. That puts particular pressures on the higher education system because students don't necessarily know what it means to go to college or how to access or navigate what is actually a fairly complex bureaucracy. There's greater financial need in the students that are coming to college, which is part of why that net tuition revenue number is so challenging. And one of the big things facing many institutions in the United States, and I believe around the world, is that after the 2008 financial crisis, there was a baby bust as opposed to a baby boom. That means that there's a demographic cliff coming. For those students who would typically go to college at the age of 18 or 19, the percentage of the population, the number of students that are going to be in that space is smaller. So what you have is all kinds of demographic challenges for traditional higher education. More first generation students who are more financially needy from more diverse backgrounds and fewer of them. That is a tremendous challenge for higher education to adapt to. The outcome, I think, is very uncertain in that space. And I think it is incumbent on us in the higher education sector to respond with care and with thought, because higher education can be the great equalizer, or it can reify existing issues and class divides within the society. And I think we are at a choice point of that, particularly in the United States. If it is all pay as you go, and those who have access to particularly high quality education are only those who can pay for it, it is not going to serve as a great equalizer. I'm also want to mention just briefly what the demographic question and also the financial question means for international students from the import and export, I guess, perspective from the US. The combination of the Trump administration and the pandemic has really shocked American higher education, I think it's safe to say, particularly around internationalization. And there's a great deal of uncertainty. I mean, we are a small institution and not an elite institution, but we have a partnership with St. Cat's and send students to St. Cat's every year for a term to up to a year. That became very shaky in the last few years, especially with the pandemic. That's a very tame international exchange. What you had on the import side is a large number of institutions like those that Dinah and Piers outlined in the UK, very dependent on international student revenue. And so when you see those budget cuts, the smaller budget cuts that are happening in higher education in the US are actually with institutions that are less dependent on international students. Those that have been highly dependent on international students are in a greater state of crisis in some cases. And I will also say that there's an active conversation at many campuses about how much on the research side, how do we do that? And do we do that with students? Do we take students on trips? And that's, again, in a state of flux. And I suspect Michelle will have some things to say about that from a more research-driven institution. I can tell you from our campus that last March, during spring break, we often send students on short research trips with their faculty. And we spent 10 days scrambling to try and get those folks home when President Trump, immediately put a ban on international travel, and we thought we would have students stranded all over the world. Since a lot of this generation and students from underrepresented groups, it shifts their notion of the excitement of international travel, I think. Quick comment about the use of technology and the future of the use of technology, particularly in institutions like mine, like Michelle's, like our beloved Trinity. There have been some surprises, I think, in this shift. And so students actually are more able to learn online in this kind of format than we might have expected. I think that we have reified the kind of interpersonal relationship appropriately, but we haven't always understood how it's created for students. And so the initial research in terms of student success, student retention, and student satisfaction suggests that the actual delivery of information online and exchange online, particularly if it's in a fairly small group, is still pretty effective. What students miss is the overall educational campus experience, what Piers called getting those corridors open again. They miss being in community with peers and with their faculty. So that suggests going forward that we may see more hybrid, we may see more different delivery modes for education. But I don't think we will lose the power of the overall campus, the residential campus experience for traditional undergraduates. But I think it will be more flexible and a little bit more dynamic, perhaps. All right, the last thing I will do is just highlight those 4 questions. I will lay out the questions. I have no answers, of course, that Catherine said that I suggested for institutions thinking as we come out of the pandemic. The first is what was actually truly essential pre-pandemic. We've had so many things that we've had to change. Some of them, you know, some of the things we were doing before, maybe we don't have to continue doing them. The second question, what were we doing pre-pandemic? Absolutely essential, that we either missed or we've had to find a way to do it because it's so essential to the educational experience. The third, should we permanently adopt some of these newly flexible systems? And I think that's a pretty active conversation across higher education. And the fourth is, were our previous strategic directions actually the right ones, given what we now know that the pandemic has exposed? So with that general framing, Catherine, I will send it back to you and then over to my colleague, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really fascinating, and it was great to hear, especially the importance of attention, I think, to first-gen students and to thinking of higher education models that don't replicate the sort of Trinity undergraduate model that are about people coming and living at campus, but being aware of the kind of vast ecology of different forms of educational institution. For people who might be interested in what that would look like in the UK, I'm just putting in the chat a book that came out from Bristol a couple of years ago, imagining a kind of radical shift of HE in the UK that would imagine access to education throughout one's lifetime. I think it was a really interesting read for me. We're going to go back now to the East Coast to Michelle Clayton. Professor Clayton is an associate professor of Hispanic Studies and Comparative Literature at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. She has a BA from Trinity in Modern Languages, a PhD from Princeton, and has also taught at UCLA as well as Brown, so different both private and public models of US higher education. Her research and teaching interests include modern poetry, avant-garde aesthetics, Latin American fiction, and dance studies. And Michelle and I got our PhDs in the same year, 2003. I was also in the US, and I've been hearing about how brilliant she is since 2003. So it was really thrilling for me to realize that not only is she brilliant, but she's also from Trinity. So Michelle's going to talk about challenges to doctoral education. She's been director of graduate studies for several years and is thinking about the changing shape of the humanities PhD. Over to you, Michelle. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Catherine. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person when you're able to get back to Providence again. So as Catherine mentioned, I've been teaching in the US for about 20 years. I came over here to do my PhD. And I've been teaching first at a public institution, most recently since 2012 at a private institution, Brown on the East Coast. My teaching is split between 2 departments, between comparative literature on the one hand and Hispanic studies on the other, and between undergraduates who, just to explain for those not familiar with the US system, tend to come to college for 4 years, and then graduate students whose trajectory tends to take about 5 to 6 years in different institutions. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my experience with those 2 populations, focused really on the present and on the challenges that we're facing at the moment and how we've been trying to deal with them and the challenges that we see coming down the pipeline. But as Piers said, really present situations exacerbating crises that were already in place. I will start on a slightly brighter note, I hope, and then get progressively darker and then try to get back to a brighter note to end on as we move into the discussion. To go back to the question of parents of undergraduates, I'm wondering whether it makes sense to send students to college at this moment in time, less a question of the value of the degree itself, right, and how the certification is going to help their children in the labor market afterwards, but really thinking about the quality of the education that they're receiving and the range of experience. Again, this question of experience that they're having in college seems really critical for the students students and for their parents. For those of us who've been teaching online, and I think that's probably most of us were given the opportunity to teach either hybrid courses or purely online, which has turned out to be logistically simpler to actually just have everybody on the same screen, looking at one another and speaking to one another without masks. We've been trying really to grapple with this question of how we bring together how we think about the quality of the education that we're engaging in, and how we try to incorporate different kinds of experiences into the classroom. So one of the large questions has been, what is missing from the educational experience in general this year? How can we try to make up for it on the faculty side? And this is partly to make the experience more satisfying for our students, but also obviously for us as faculty, right? Trying to replicate experiences that can't quite be replicated online and that need to then follow different avenues. So what's lacking on Zoom, some of the obvious points, right? The idea of community co-presence in the classroom, the ability to read one another's body language, easing into a discussion at the beginning of class, right? A discussion which will then flow smoothly over the course of the 50 minutes or the 80 minutes that we're in the classroom together. I usually like to think of this as, almost like a kind of a game of volleyball, right? Throwing a ball up in the air and having students pass it to one another. And I think in the early days of Zoom, this was a little bit more akin to, going back to playing Pong, where it was very slow batting back and forth between me and the students of particular points, and trying to find ways for them to actually engage with one another, dealing with the fact that there's no laughter, there's no spontaneity in Zoom itself. So having really to work with the halting rhythms of Zoom. So to find some new way to allow those halting rhythms to actually find a place in the classroom and modulate our teaching in different kind of ways. So quite unexpectedly, and I think this picks up on a couple of points that were made earlier by Marcy and by Dinah, that this has in some ways, I think, made us more patient as teachers. It's made us more prepared to run different kinds of class sessions and more willing to insert pauses for reflection. Now, it's also, as has also come up, it's made us much more aware of the differences between our students. We're seeing different student populations, even as we're not seeing them, right? With backgrounds that people are choosing to hide the background that they're zooming in from, if they're zooming in from home, students who are also not able to zoom in from home, or students who are zooming in from isolated locations on campus. So we're trying to think about different ways that we can be cognizant of that and then create a different kind of community which helps students to connect to one another. I think another aspect that we've that's become more palpable to us as a result of having to think about teaching over Zoom is the different learning styles of our students. So those of us who had previously avoided computers completely in the classroom, and I was absolutely one of those, I like to have students focus for the time that they're together and focus on listening to and reacting to one another, have now had to integrate them smoothly into the space of discussion, into the very texture of discussion. So this has opened up some really surprisingly useful possibilities. It's given us the ability to move across screens, which is obviously harder to do in person. And this means that we can direct students to different spaces while we're in the thick of a discussion, and be confident that we're not losing them, that they're not being too distracted by this moving. But it's also really prompted us to open up other spaces for discussion. So rather than really placing a premium on in-class discussion in the classroom, which privileges those students who are just much more comfortable participating in person, many of us have opened up other documents in the background, so course blogs that students can contribute to either before class with a comment, during class sometimes, or after class looking back on something. It gives us a way of actually measuring how all of the students in our class are learning, are dealing with the materials, are processing them, and are responding to one another. I've started to do this even more this semester, where I have a large seminar of 28 students, which is quite difficult to manage on even on the screen itself. but opening documents during breakout rooms so that students talking amongst themselves in a small group can actually type. While they're there, I can see how they're working with materials and they can respond to one another afterwards. Another element of this, another way in which we're trying to engage with Zoom and its possibilities is to ask students to work on collaborative projects outside the classroom, and very often to bring some kind of creative dimension into this so that there's a feel of a flow between classroom space and possibly extracurricular interests, whether it be piano or theatre or creative writing or community outreach, social justice campaigns, different ways in which students can toggle back and forth between what they're learning in the classroom, what they're actually engaged in outside, and how they can also then share that with their classmates. So this has been very helpful for us, I think, as a way of thinking about the possibilities of technology rather than thinking of technology as necessarily deleterious to the learning experience. It's been obviously a kind of baptism by fire. It's been very much a baptism by fire for our graduate students, who have increasingly been expected to be able to work with technology. Over the past year, they've been doing interviews, campus visits, where that's been actually a possibility via Zoom, and having to share sample classes as part of their application materials for jobs. However, and this is where my talk becomes a little bit darker, our graduate students are not doing well. As we've been discussing around the question of internationalization, particularly in the US, students have not been able to get into the country. We admitted 3 students this year into our PhD program in Hispanic Studies. One was able to arrive in September, one was able to arrive now, another is stuck in a third country waiting for a visa to be issued and likely to have to defer until the fall again. So we're facing very difficult situations, particularly in departments that thrive on attracting international students. I'm not quite sure how this will spool out in coming years. Conversely, some can't actually get out of the country, and that means leaving the country to do research. They can't get to archives or libraries that are closed or that intermittently open and close. Also, many of our students can't travel to visit their family. And for the case of international students who arrived in the country last year, this has been desperately difficult for them to deal with during their time with us. So it's clear to us that everybody in our graduate community is going to experience setbacks. Some of those setbacks are going to be practical. They're going to involve research access. Some of them are going to be physical in terms of dealing with the pandemic. And many of those will involve mental health. So these pose many challenges to those of us who work closely with graduate students. We're having to try to modify our ways of dealing with them and the kind of support that we can give them, which is increasingly becoming pastoral as we move forward. But then compounding this is the fact that the job market in English and modern languages which was already in crisis, has entirely collapsed over the past year. It's now a full-blown catastrophe. There have been ever fewer jobs advertised over the last few years. Ever fewer of those were in tenure track positions. So this is part of the adjunctification of labor in the US university. And this year there were none. So students who graduated over the past year graduated into an entirely frozen market. Students who were in some cases in advanced stages in their searches and had made it to a shortlist suddenly found their possibilities completely closed off. Universities have been slashing new hires as the easiest way of tightening belts. Obviously, there are no visible victims, right? The person who's hired is not then being fired. So this is a very difficult situation to be contemplating for graduate students. So the question then is, what do we do in this situation about doctoral education? So right now we've paused admissions so that we can reserve funds for our current students. We're hoping that admissions will reopen further on down the road, but there is of course a danger of reduction in the number of students we can admit, mergers of departments. We're beginning to see this in a number of institutions. We're seeing the administration in many cases considering this to be a problem around graduate training. In other words, we're not giving our graduate students the right training for the jobs that we are trying to go into, that they are trying to apply for, and inviting us as a result to rethink the PhD. But I think it's very clear to those of us who are spending any time thinking about this question that this is not the problem. The problem is universities cutting back on tenure track hires. So not replacing retirements, not replacing lost positions, not developing our departments in new directions, and instead hiring adjunct laborers, or sometimes as fig leafs, visiting assistant professors or postdocs for a year or two. So the question then is, what can we do as faculty? On the one hand, we have to attend to the practicalities and the mental health of our students. We need to continue to train them for jobs in academia, hoping that jobs will open up again, while also being absolutely candid and clear-eyed about the fact that this is not likely to happen anytime soon. We can try to nudge them towards alternative careers, or really encourage them in pursuing other interests, right? Interest in the public humanities, interest in creative writing, interest in museum curation, but at the same time recognizing that all of those jobs, all of those fields themselves have their own processes of training and hiring, and are subject to the same pressures that academia is facing right now. So to end on a perhaps more positive note, I think as we're all realizing the need to continue to lobby for tenure track jobs, we're also paying more attention to the situation of adjuncts and lobbying for fair treatment and payment for adjuncts. And our professional organization, the Modern Language Association, has actually been fantastic with this. And that really has been one of the bright spots of the pandemic, the way in which our professional organization has stepped up to really foreground the question of precarity, precarity among our undergraduate populations, among our graduate student populations, and then among our adjunct communities. So this seems to me at least one positive note, that this is in the foreground and something that we're now being forced to discuss. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on the professional organizations, and we were lucky to have a great president in charge when this hit. We're, of course, fully in that adjunctification crisis here, though we sometimes give our adjuncts fancy lunches as well, which I think doesn't make up for the loss of a stable career. I am going to invite all the speakers to ready themselves for questions. We're seeing questions come in the chat already, and I'm going to bat them round to various people, but I'd also like the speakers to unmute themselves and weigh in after the principal answerer has had a go at it, if there are ways in which it speaks to your experience or interests. So the first question, we have two questions, in fact, about international students that I think have come up in response to Dinah's talk. A question about the ethical issues involved in accepting large numbers of Chinese students given human rights records. And then Trudy Watt, former senior tutor here, asking about the imagining of possible costs and benefits for UK higher education in relation to migration from Hong Kong that will happen in the near future. Dinah, do you want to come in on this? And if anybody else would like to come in afterwards, that would be great.
Thanks, Mark and Trudy. I'll take these two questions together because I think they are linked. Firstly, Mark, your question is a very serious and very challenging question. And the treatment, particularly of the Uyghur minorities, but also recent events in Hong Kong, were very much in my mind when I spoke about the political challenges of admitting large numbers of Chinese students. The first thing I would say is that I do think it's a responsibility for us all, and certainly for our government, to protest really in the most vigorous terms about human rights abuses in China, and about what's happening particularly to the Uyghurs. And I'm sure we can all agree it is deeply concerning, to put it at its mildest, to learn what is happening there. But your question is, what can we do to address those issues if we assume we will continue to educate Chinese students? So one thing that I think we can do, and certainly are doing in Liverpool, I know this is happening elsewhere in the sector, is to include within the way in which we assimilate our Chinese students into our academic culture a very specific emphasis on issues around values, around ethics, and around human rights. It's not something that we tiptoe around in Liverpool or elsewhere. So we do expect our Chinese students to conform in formal terms to our values, but perhaps more importantly, we go out of our way to include in our educational brief, if you like, with our Chinese students. So, and this is across disciplines. I'm not just talking about students in humanities, social sciences, also talking about our Chinese engineers, our financial, actuarial students, of whom we have a great many. We do include as at the top of the agenda an educational program in values, in ethics, in human rights. We also, as part of that, make much more effort than frankly we used to ensure that those Chinese students do not wall themselves off in their own communities, but really do find connections with other international students and with our home students within the universities, within a social and cultural program. In other words, simply exposing those students to a different code of values, I think is one contribution that we can make to that challenge. Now, I'm not going to pretend for a moment, nor would you expect me to, that that is going to solve this massive anxiety. Nor am I going to make predictions. One thing, again, we've learned over the last year, predictions are mug's game. I'm not going to make predictions as to how this challenge will evolve and what our longer term response will be. But I do continue to believe in connections between communities, connections between cultures, that those thousands and thousands of really intelligent, thoughtful, curious young people, because they are, who come over here to the West, to the UK and elsewhere, the exposure to different ways of thinking and different ways of living will in the long term be positive. Turning to your point about Hong Kong, Trudy, we, as it happens in Liverpool, have some very active research collaborations with universities in Hong Kong, notably Hong Kong Polytechnic University, where you'll remember there was a particular role that they played in recent political events. And we feel as a university, in fact, particular responsibility to support those colleagues, those academic colleagues at various career stages in those universities. They really do need and certainly appreciate, tell us often that they do, our continuing engagement with our research programs. We have a very lively program, for instance, in developing research approaches to heritage, international heritage. It's been important to us, it's important to them. In terms of your specific question, Trudy, the likely influx of migrants from Hong Kong to the UK, of course there will be costs, but in my view, they are very likely to be outweighed by the benefits of welcoming those migrants, as I very much hope we will as a nation and as a sector do. We're certainly committed to doing that in Liverpool. There is already a very, very numerous and actually long established community of Chinese people from Hong Kong in Liverpool, in our Chinatown. So people from Hong Kong of various backgrounds are already very attracted to Liverpool. So we will work with that community to welcome Hong Kong migrants, whether or not they have a connection with higher education. Many of them will. I think that the benefits for us of making room in our country for these extremely capable, thoughtful, intelligent individuals coming to us from a very troubled country, the benefits in the long term, I think, will be very significant. So I hope that we will open our doors to them.
Thanks, Dinah. That was a properly teacherly response, I think, to think about what to do with students coming from particular demographics, from particular political histories. That's a nice model of what a university can do. I saw that I think Piers and Mary want to come in on this question, and then we'll move on. Piers, do you want to respond?
Well, it wasn't so much to respond, but just sort of linking perhaps some of the points that Dinah has been raising with some of the points that Michelle was raising about the realities of Zoom teaching. We have become very conscious this year at the LSE, but I'm sure lots of other universities have had this experience of the potential political sensitivity of what we teach when we're teaching students who actually are still physically in China, but actually the same applies to several other countries around the world, because we teach them stuff that is borderline illegal, in certain cases totally illegal. So I will be teaching in a few weeks' time a class in my Cold War course on the Tiananmen Square massacres. Now, it's very difficult for my 2 Chinese students on a Zoom line to sort of participate fully in this discussion, knowing that the ideas that I'd like them to explore are potentially ideas that could get them into some trouble. And I've noticed that one young man who is in China has started frequently joining the class from rather noisy restaurants. And I suspect one of the reasons he's doing this is precisely that it makes it much harder for the security services to snoop on what he's saying in the context of class. The only problem is because the restaurants are so noisy, we can't hear what he's saying either. But that's an incidental problem. So it does strike me that there is a sort of, we're being made very aware of these issues by the strangeness of teaching in the context of a pandemic. Just a very brief extra on the point that Dinah was making about the welcome to people from Hong Kong. I'd love it were that the case. I do fear, however, that as far as academics are concerned, some of the points that Michelle was raising about the lack of openings within both the United States and Britain means that we are going to struggle to make space for an influx of highly talented people who, in an ideal world, we would certainly want to offer university positions to, but I do worry where we're going to find the positions to offer them.
Well, I would give anything to hear a scene from a noisy restaurant right now, or even better to be in one. Mary, I think you wanted to come in on this. Is that right?
I'll be quite brief, actually, and just mention that I think that the points that Dinah outlined so well are ones that at least I'm seeing our accrediting agencies start to wrestle with and say, when we look at partnerships that universities have created with China, with Hong Kong, whether that's a research partnership or a student exchange or a student feeder partnership, that they're looking much more deeply at the question of academic freedom and what that truly means in terms of intellectual, in terms of the values of Western higher education. So I won't expand on that except to say that that is a newly active, I'm a member of the accrediting commission for the Western states in the US, and that is a newly active space, and I suspect will remain so. And I think it's a combination of what we've seen, not only in China and Hong Kong, but what we've seen in our own administration in the United States in the last 4 years.
Thank you. I see that Mark's iPad has its hand raised, and it was Mark's iPad that asked the initial question. Mark, do you want to come in on that, or should we move on to an...
Yes, if I could just follow up on that question very briefly of China, because I mean, I struggle with this too, around Trinity Physics 1977, but I can currently chair the accreditation panel of the Green Climate Fund, and we have entities that are based in China. And, you know, on the one hand, we need to be helping them to do things for climate change. On the other hand, I struggle with what they're doing in human rights. And it's not just the Uyghur population, but also obviously Hong Kong. But also, you know, they jailed journalists for reporting on the COVID in the beginning. And I sort of suspect that Myanmar, the military, the Chinese are somewhat behind the military in Myanmar at the moment. So, you know, China is flexing its muscles. You have a lot of students over here, and they're probably innocent. But on the one hand, Dina's answer is perfectly acceptable. On the other hand, don't we need more? I mean, you've got a captive audience, and I'm not saying you want to sort of indoctrinate them, so to speak, with human rights issues, but what can be done to really get to the problem of the leadership in China? Because they don't take any notice. They really don't. I mean, the West are irrelevant to them. And what will make them take notice, I don't know, because they deny it all, and it's very, very important.
I think we might have to ask that we have a foreign relations Trinity conversation at another moment, but I think we all very much take your point. And Michelle is commenting about countries subject to official restrictions with Zoom: Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria. I know that colleagues who've been trying to share films with students in particular countries have been unable to do that. Also, there are all sorts of strange experiences of foreign relations going on in the classroom in ways that you know, we'd previously imagined it as a separate space, I think, perhaps naively. Dinah, do you want to come back in?
Just very briefly to pick up your point, Mark, about the environment and the climate emergency. It's so difficult, isn't it, to balance priorities and ethical demands on universities' activities in research and teaching. I mean, I feel very strongly, as of course do we all, about the immediate and urgent claims of the climate emergency on us in universities. And you don't need to be a world, excuse me, expert in climate change to know what a huge contribution China as an industrial nation is making to that emergency. So to include our Chinese students as their future leaders in China within programs of education around climate change and around the climate emergency is in itself thinking perhaps of the longer term future of humanity, if that doesn't sound too grandiose, you know, is in itself, I think, a hugely pressing issue for us. And again, something that we now take very seriously for all of our students, but we have made a point of actively including our Chinese cohort in that education to really try to hammer home and to reiterate in module after module and different sorts of models of communication that the immediate need for action around climate change. So it's yet another difficult challenge around assimilating those ethical complications around teaching Chinese students. I would include the climate emergency among those challenges.
Thank you. If we can, they're certainly related, go from the future of humanity to the future of the humanities. We have a question about the Auger report, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment, just so we can open up conversation to a sort of international response. Theo Mills is thinking about the potential greater demand for STEM subjects at university in response to COVID, both I'm imagining medical research, but also thinking about computer engineering and so on. What can be done to maintain the profile and perceived value of arts degrees among students and employers alike? This is, yeah, a crucial question, I think, in both these university systems and indeed further afield. Does anyone have any magic wand, please? Michelle, do you?
I definitely don't have a magic wand, but I can jump in with just, a couple of thoughts about this. Coming out of recent experiences, and maybe this will only apply to the US scenario where students, as you probably know, at the undergraduate level, spend 4 years taking an array of different courses. And although they'll major in a particular subject, if they're majoring in the humanities, they have a very small number of classes that they have to take in order to receive the major, and then can roam widely beyond that. a lot of the students in sciences also try to take courses in the humanities for one reason or another. I've had a lot of computer science students in my courses on the international avant-garde over the past couple of years, so possibly wanting to think about possible interfaces between computer science and artistic languages, right? And thinking about languages in a very broad sense there. There has also been a concerted effort on the part of technology companies in the US to look for undergraduates with humanities degrees as precisely the kinds of students who are capable of working in multiple languages, different kinds of languages. We've even seen this at the graduate level. So PhD students being recruited by Apple, recruited by Google, in different spaces. So there is an articulation in the minds of potential employers in the computer sector or technology sector. There's certainly an interest in undergraduates with arts degrees. In terms of how we defend the arts degree within the university itself, that's a separate question. As we're dealing with it at the moment in doctoral education, science programs have continued to admit students this year because they rely upon or they work with external funding in a way that departments in the humanities don't and can't. So there is going to be a continuity there that is not available to us in the arts. At the same time, we're very aware of the restrictions on their research, the restrictions on colleagues who are hiring postdocs to work with them and can't get access to the machines that they need to, can't get access to the spaces or the opportunities for collaboration. So that doesn't answer the question. That maybe opens up a couple more. I'll open up from there.
It's a whole wormhole of future questions. Mary has something to say, I think.
Yeah, this is, it's a really challenging space because I think that it actually goes back to the point that Pierce originally made about why students go to college. And the more we promote college as a pathway to a good job, and you know, and I think we have done that more and more over the years, the more than the outcomes measured are how quickly were you employed and how much money did you make. And I think that we have to change the dialogue from higher education as a commodity and that kind of linear sense. One about higher education's initial purpose, which is it means to have, yes, Trinity 91 politics, right? So that's the way. I also know that's a very difficult conversation to start because it is more philosophical. I will say that I think one of the things Michelle touched on has some hope in building, if not the major, at least the breadth of students' experience. I'm from Silicon Valley, and indeed tech companies are starting to think much more about it's not, I don't know that they do very much just for because it's the right thing to do, but what they're seeing is the places where they're falling short in their employees and in their capacity. And so they are looking much more now to hire students with these backgrounds or social science backgrounds. And one of the basic reasons for that is we haven't reached the end of the internet, but we may have reached the end of some of the deep infrastructure, right? So a lot of the growth of computer science was around needing to put all of the infrastructure in place. And there's certainly evolutions, et cetera, but there's also way too much time being spent on building apps that nobody needs because they haven't figured out what's next. And part of what's next is making technology more serve humanity better, or be more human, or be more engaged. And so that's an active conversation that's happening in Silicon Valley. I can give you a kind of interesting specific example. My institution a few years ago built a unique, conscious that unique is a very specific word. It actually is a unique partnership with a coding academy in San Francisco. We don't offer computer science as a degree. We're a small institution. It doesn't make sense for us to do that. We're extraordinarily good at liberal education and the liberal arts. So we partnered with them. They provide the computer science courses, and my institution provides all of the other courses that Michelle was talking about, all of the access to liberal education. They wanted that. And then they have partnerships with a number of companies in Silicon Valley who are very interested in graduates who have a broader depth or wider depth of background as they come in. So they want them to have some basic coding capacity, basic computer science literacy, but they don't necessarily all have to be computer science scientists who are going to go in and code. So I think there is some hope there. That looks specifically at that industry, however, and I think from a personal standpoint, and one which I would love it if someone came up with a great response. My larger concern is not about the industry. My larger concern is actually about our democratic societies and this notion that higher education has become only a personal good, when in fact it is designed to be much more than that. And I think we have lost that. I don't know if we've lost the argument, but we have certainly lost purchase on that argument.
That's the kind of great model of the US liberal arts, which I think is so powerful, and which, you know, we don't quite have access to in the same way. I think Dinah wants to come in.
Yeah, I would agree with that point very strongly, Mary. I just quickly want to return to Michelle's important points about doctoral education and the challenges that we're all facing there. Of course, they're not confined to the US or indeed to the UK, nor are they confined to the humanities and social sciences. There's a huge challenge. But one thing that is happening increasingly in the UK is the introduction of large-scale programs across universities to prepare doctoral graduates for careers outside academia, to communicate to them that this is not, as has previously been thought, some kind of deep personal failure to take a successful doctorate and move into some cognate or sometimes really quite different area of employment, where people with doctorates will thrive and flourish. Of course, that's always been the case, but very often people have arrived at that destination, various circuitous routes. But I think it's now really important for our doctoral students, and here I include doctoral students in STEM subjects, in life sciences, across the board, to have different careers. And similarly, it's important as we do prepare our undergraduates for employment to communicate to them more actively than we've always succeeded in doing in the past, that there is an enormous range of careers in which they can succeed, that they don't necessarily have to be as it or move into teaching paths. All sorts of new opportunities arising. One of the deficiencies in the UK, perhaps not so much in the US, is the measurement in really quite mechanical ways of the success of graduates according to levels of earnings. But in the creative arts and humanities generally, career portfolios can often be very different. People move into employment through much more sometimes fragmented ways with part-time employment. But 5 years down the line, when you measure the longer term outcomes, you find that graduates with humanities degrees, social science degrees, are perfectly able to compete with graduates from what might immediately look like more employable disciplines, like, for instance, law. So there is a lot of mechanistic thinking of the kind that Mary's touched on when people are measuring the values of degrees, both in terms of personal development, or also actually in terms of longer term economic outcomes.
If I can come back in on this question of measuring, Michelle, do you want to?
No, just to say, I completely agree. Very often, actually, the battle that we need to, or the place that we need to take up that argument is with our own administrations, that even when there's an agreement across the disciplines, actually think about alternatives to academia and to really try to present this to the students as an absolutely acceptable outcome, rather than something that we support them with completely, and removing any sense of this is a taboo subject, which has been the case, since the 90s, really. That we're fine now having those discussions with our students. It's our administrations who still take as going back to measurement and the metric, right? The number of students in PhD programs who go on to tenure supporting, offering tenure track jobs, right? So
metrics. We've been doing very broad scale predictions. I'm going to ask us to come back to Tola O'Brien's more specific question regarding the future. This is the Auger report. I haven't spoken to anybody live for so long, I can't remember how you say that name. To which the recent initial response from the UK government was extraordinarily brief. We've been promised more about what that report will do to shift UK higher education coming soon. So this is maybe a UK specific question to close out on, because we also have to predict dinner coming in about 10 minutes. How significant do you expect the changes of that report to be? Piers, let me come over to you. If you're a gambling man, what would you say?
I don't think the odds are good that it will lead to any very precise change. Sort of, I thought it was, to the extent that I've engaged with its contents, I thought it was a fairly mixed bag. I thought there was some excellent stuff about the problems of the FE sector and some of the participants in the sort of higher education world that were lower down the feeding chain, to use my earlier language. But I don't think it, I thought some of its proposals on the wider financial questions were not very imaginative. I do worry, because I think this is a debate in a sense we ought to be having, we need to be having, but at the same time there's a large part of me as the sort of political analyst, although I'm a historian because I'm much better at predicting the past than I am at the future, but there is a bit of me that is deeply worried about having a debate about university finances and how we get away from the sort of model that so many of us have somewhat lamented in the course of our interventions tonight, in a situation where every government, whether we're talking United States, Britain, continental Europe, or anywhere else, is going to be deeply indebted because of the current situation. Sort of if government finances look as rocky as they are likely to look for the next 10, 20 years, the idea that we will go back to a very generous model of state provision for higher education is, I'm afraid, a little bit of a fantasy. So perhaps we should be clinging on to what we've got more than hoping to radically change the model. But that sounds a terribly sort of cowardly and pessimistic note to end on.
Dinah, do you have things you're bracing for at Liverpool in relation to?
Yeah, well, firstly, I must say I really do welcome the prioritisation of the needs of further education alongside those of higher education, as long as the support of further education is not at the expense of higher education, which I think could be very damaging. Going back to Piers' point about concerns and anxieties, the thing that haunts me with anxiety, if I'm honest, is the way in which the government keeps circling round the 7.5K student fee threat. And I think threat is the word that I'm looking for. Michelle, Mary, this perhaps won't mean so much to you, but it means a huge amount in the UK. As Piers has made clear, we barely balance the books at the current level of student fee. Now, if the government does give in to the temptation, it's a political temptation, I think, as much as anything else, to implement an all-round reduction in level of student fees, then we will be looking at a very major restructuring of the sector, and not in a positive way. And we do keep hearing subterranean murmurs and rumblings that they have not entirely moved away from that thought. We hear mixed messages, and again, as I said earlier, predictions amongst game. I worry about that.
Can I there's going to be a lot to worry about this morning at 3 a.m. I think. Can I just give a sort of parallel question very briefly for a 30-second response from Mary and Michelle? Is the Biden administration going to radically change the position on student debt, yay or nay?
I think I can do that in 5 seconds, yes. I think they're going to actually change many things within the DOE. I think one of the somewhat underreported stories for obvious reasons. There were lots of things to report in the last 4 years, but one of the underreported stories was the radical shift in the Department of Education across the board. Financial aid, student debt, the support of for-profit colleges that exploit students, the change in responses to how students, what we call Title IX, which is basically our Equity Act for particularly around gender. I suspect the first 6 months to a year will be focused on two things. One is rolling back a number of pretty radical changes at the policy level that had been implemented. And the second will be to try and do something dramatic in the way of in the student debt space. And I suspect that will look like forgiveness of debt for a certain period of time for, if not all students, at least a large percentage of students. That's my immediate reaction. Michelle, you may have some additional thoughts in that space.
No,
I was so equivocal. Please feel free to disagree.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I also just very quickly to loop back to the question of internationalization, we also look forward to the correction of some policies that were implemented last year, when the absolutely callous and capricious policy that incoming international students, in order to qualify for a visa, had to be taking one in-person class at a time when none of us were offering in-person classes. So that's been a lot of the scrambling over the past year. So there's a lot to tackle. There's a lot that the Biden administration needs to get going with out of the gate. They're beginning in that way, and they do seem, particularly on the question of student debt, the signs seem to be promising.
Let's hope so. So Mary was saying there's been a lot of news lately. Let's hope that there will be some good news in the years to come. I really want to thank you all so much for your energy and commitment to really exciting conversations. When I was telling various friends that I was chairing a panel on the future of higher education, the response was mostly a sort of hollow laugh. But I found this immensely energizing and moving, actually, the ways in which people are thinking strategically about classroom experience, but also about foreign relations. We're working at every scale. And I also just want to end by saying that one of the things I have enjoyed about the present moment in higher education is the presence of cats. So I'd like to especially welcome the cat of Sarah Jenkinson, who made a lovely and very well-behaved appearance.
Excellent cat, excellent baby. That was
yeah. A very good baby too. Yeah, sorry, I notice cats more. I'm sorry. I do want to thank you all for speaking, and for those of you in the audience, thank you for attending, and thank you for putting your questions here.